Folks. Of course, my doorbell just rang, so give me a minute, and I was calming dogs that were quite excited. Be just 1 second to switch on. Dr. Kramer is here. You don't have to be here at all, but I'm thank you for popping on. My fabulous co-author, and just a note, we are recording today. I am happy to have some of my students here with me, but others are unable to make it. So you can absolutely share the recording too, if you shoot me a note. All right. Here we go. Okay. One more thing. It's so great to have you all here. 55 folks. Wow. I'm really, really honored. Thank you. So Dr. Kramer and I have been studying what's called prison gerrymandering for a while. And so I can talk as much or as little about different aspects as you'd like. I'm going to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions because we could go many different directions. But first, just going to give you sort of a lay of the land. What we're hoping to do is to tell you what it is, tell you what Dr. Kramer's and my research contribution is, and how we do it to this topic. And then we're going to highlight some of our findings from Pennsylvania as a way to sort of showcase and understand how it works. And then we're going to segue to some really exciting policy impact that our research has had, and sort of, yeah, some key highlights there, and then what we're working on now, because as many of you know, most states are either redistricting as we speak their political representation maps, or already have voted in their maps with the brand new 2020 census data. So I think that's it. All right. We have, very briefly, because it's been a wild time. So just, you might remember this from history or civics class way back when, but in theory, every person is counted equally when we draw political districts, right? Including non-voters, because that's how the Supreme Court currently defines political representation, as they define equal representation based on total population counts, right? This is often called the one person, one vote rule, right? So in principle, equal representation means that everyone is guaranteed representation, right? Including children, right, who can't vote, non-citizens, as well as people who are incarcerated for a felony. Right? In Pennsylvania, about 45,000 people currently can't vote in prison, but they're counted for apportioning political representation, because you don't have to be an eligible voter to contact your legislator or use the services provided by your legislator's offices. Right? So why is this so important? because our democracy hinges on this concept of equal representation, right? Without it, we don't have a functioning democracy. Right? So in order to ensure that we work toward having a functioning democracy, we redraw our political maps every 10 years, right? That's why that was the original sole purpose of the census was, well, it's used for many things today. It is so that we know the government counts how many people live in the United States and where they live, so that states can then, as well as local communities, Congress, adjust their maps to ensure equal representation, right? So this is seems pretty simple, right? But the Census Bureau in this particular instance counts incarcerated people as residents of the political districts where they're incarcerated instead of their home districts. Right? And this is just an administrative policy that dates back over 200 years, right? Long before mass incarceration existed. So it had little impact for a very long time. It was just like a data technicality rule, right? But this matters a whole lot now because we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, right? And it matters because states, localities, everyone for the most part uses that census data to draw their political districts. That's what prison gerrymandering is, right? Because it politically advantages districts that don't have anyone incarcerated. So prison gerrymandering occurs because of where prisons are located and the rampant racial disparities among incarcerated folks in the US, right? So most of you know this, but prisons are generally located in rural or suburban areas. And those districts are primarily white, right? While the people occupying those prison beds in their district are disproportionately come from urban districts, right? And disproportionately people, communities of color. So what does this mean in practical terms? Counting incarcerated people where they're confined makes it easier for people who live in a district with a prison to get their concerns heard by their legislator, right? Because their district contains what we call phantom constituents, those folks in orange. Right? The legislators of those primarily rural and suburban districts don't consider incarcerated folks to be their constituents, and incarcerated people's concerns are usually like totally unrelated to what the district where they're confined's concerns are, right? They're usually about their community back home, their community of color. And, they're worried about housing costs, they're worried about programming in their kids' schools, things that are not going to be addressed by their legislator, even if they did consider them one. And so so we've got this imbalance of power, right? And in extreme cases, prison gerrymandering allows some districts to meet the legal definition of equal representation only because they have a prison full of phantom constituents, right? So this has been likened to the 3/5 compromise, right? Where, where Black enslaved persons were used to inflate white political power in the South, right? Several hundred years ago. And here we are today in 2022, where we still have a different form, but similar effect, where Black bodies, brown bodies are being essentially used to advantage districts that contain largely white Americans, right? All right, so this is just to give you a little visual of what we're talking about. This is called a racial dot map. It's just census data, so one dot equals one person, and this shows us how spread out Pennsylvania residents are in District 8. So this is Western Central PA, and it has Mercer State Correctional Facility. And so the blue are white residents, and the green dots denote Black residents. And as you can see, all of the Black folks who are counted as living in this political district are clearly incarcerated inside of SCI Mercer, right? Whereas the white residents are far away and much more spread out. Right? I'm jumping ahead. Okay. So clearly, incarcerated persons are, making districts a lot bigger than they actually are. They're also making them look more racially diverse, right? If we were to pull up the census statistics for this district, you're like, oh, wow, that's a lot more diverse than I would have thought for rural Pennsylvania. It's because the deck is stacked with incarcerated folks, right, who aren't meaningful members of their community in any way. So how big of a deal is this, right? Well, you might have heard of the Prison Policy Initiative's work. If you've ever heard of prison gerrymandering, they have done wonderful advocacy, raising awareness to this issue for almost 20 years. But and they have been emphasizing this issue of, well, we've got these districts that only meet legal criteria to have equal representation because they've got a prison in them, right? And so Dr. Kramer's and my contribution was thinking about how those folks aren't just advantaging primarily white residents' political power, making it easier for them to contact their legislator, they're also disadvantaging the districts that they're missing from, right? And so as social scientists, we, I study the consequences of mass incarceration, and Dr. Kramer is a race expert in segregation, racial segregation sort of thing among many other talents. And so we really wanted to know, well, how's this impacting the communities where they're missing from, that are primarily communities of color, right? The census policy doesn't just benefit communities that have a prison, it's also taking those folks, disadvantaging other communities, right? And so that's what we set out to originally study a couple of years ago. And because Black and Brown communities are disproportionately policed, we have, residents of districts with high incarceration rates are going to be especially impacted, right? Why? Because it's harder for those residents to get their concerns heard by their legislator, because their legislator is incredibly overworked, right? On top of their own constituents, right? Legislators representing districts with high incarceration rates are also fielding requests from those incarcerated folks. And Dr. Kramer and I have been fortunate to spend a lot of time talking with those folks, and those legislators take those calls, right? They're, even though they're technically not counted in their district, right? They work really hard for those folks because they often have really pressing concerns, like they haven't gotten their medication in a week and they're diabetic, right? Or they're, concerned about something going back home, and this is how they can try to support their family is by, by engaging in some political action, right? So we've got folks who are doing double duty, right? Who are making, as a state legislator are, making the same amount of money as the person who has a prison in their district who has a whole lot less of a workload, right? And importantly, this policy impacts every single person that lives in that district with a high incarceration rate. Even if they have never been pulled over for a traffic ticket, it's going to reduce their representation, right? And so that's how, in a nutshell, prison gerrymandering creates unequal political representation, right? And it's particularly a big deal because it creates racially unequal representation, as I'm going to show you in a moment, right? White people have more political influence at the expense of people of color. And here's a, show you another much more local example. This is District 150 in Southeast PA. It's the largest urban area in the state, obviously, and District 150 has 2 prisons. Many of you are familiar with SCI Phoenix, formerly Graterford, where a lot of our students in our college program exists, but that's at the top. That's the massive green dots, right? And then we have Montgomery County Jail is the lower one, bottom green mass. These districts, so this is a pretty suburban area. Not only are these 2 prisons impacting the size of District 150, but most of those green dots, the people incarcerated in those facilities, they came from other districts, right? And you can see that the rest of District 150 is largely white, right? And largely suburban, a little rural. Okay, so the good news is that roughly a dozen states so far have ended prison gerrymandering by counting people in their home communities instead of where they're incarcerated, right? And adjusting their political boundaries to try to achieve equal representation. It's not terribly complicated. It just requires a little bit of extra work because of how you have to adjust the census data, right? And we do this we redistrict everything every 10 years. And this is a really exciting time because we're in this redistricting process, right? So good timing for Freedom School for you to learn a little bit more about this. So what's going on in PA? So Dr. Kramer and I wanted to quantify, like, okay, this seems like a big deal, but like how much? We're social scientists, we're data nerds, right? And so we wanted to know, what would happen to our, so Pennsylvania is still in the process of voting in new maps. So we still technically have, I believe we're still under the current maps, which is what our analysis is, which is based on the last census, the 2010 census, right? What would it look like? How would representation have to shift if we removed incarcerated folks from the districts where they're incarcerated and return them back to their home districts, right? So yeah, that's what we did. We first took folks out of the facilities, right, where they're counted. This is not fancy statistics or anything in that way, but and we looked at, and then we returned them, right, to see which districts are their districts too big, too small, what's happening racially, and we use publicly available data, right, from the census, from the State Department of Corrections, and then those redistricting files. So. Clicking the wrong one. Sorry. This is a very just Pennsylvania showing what we see here is that there are 34 districts that experience the most change in our hypothetical scenario, where we removed incarcerated folks and returned them to their home districts. And the districts highlighted in gray on the maps are those which lost more than 837 districts, which for the statisticians is one standard deviation. And then in contrast, the districts that are black are on the map are districts that gain at least 837 new residents when we count incarcerated people in their home communities, right? So you can see spatially the really unequal impact of prison gerrymandering across the state on this map. You can't really see what's going on in Philly, right? So we got to zoom in, and District 150 that we were just looking at a moment ago is in the gray district in the upper left by the Montgomery County label. That district lost the most population after we removed and returned because they've got that state facility and a county jail, right? It lost over 5,000 people. And our state districts in Pennsylvania are at least of the 2010 census, roughly 60,000 people. they lost 5,000, right? The nearby Black district that contains Norristown is, as many of you know, predominantly Latinx and Black community. And not surprisingly, the 3 districts in Philly shaded Black each gain a lot of population. So 2 of them are contiguous, they're touching, that's why you can't quite see, but there are 3 there. And as many of you know Philly well, these districts are located, not surprisingly, in the heart of Philly's African-American neighborhoods, right? So we see that overall, we've got a lot of shifting of power, shifting from away from urban areas to rural areas. And importantly, that happens without adding a single voter to a district, right? It's a very insidious effect. But you might be wondering, are any of these, like, have they changed enough to legally matter, to become too big, too small, etc.? So again, this is based on the current maps using the 2010 data that will soon be changing, and I'm excited to talk to you about those. But for the state as a whole, 4 districts became legally too small in our hypothetical scenario, right? And that means they're only compliant with the Supreme Court's definition of how we define equal representation only because of they have a prison in them, right? And then 4 districts would be too large, on the other hand, if incarcerated folks were counted in their home communities, right? Meaning that they would need to be split up, that people are underrepresented. And that's about 264,000 Pennsylvania residents just live in those 4 districts, right? And there are many districts that don't quite meet the threshold, but we have people who are, underrepresented in a handful too, right? So we've got a whole lot of Pennsylvania residents who are constitutionally underrepresented, and unfortunately, and not surprisingly, there are very big race impacts. But one more thing I want to say here. This is not so you notice that the largest, the district that lost the most was a largely suburban district. And I just want to note that this is not a major rural versus urban divide. And that's because while Pennsylvania has a whole lot of incarcerated folks and many prisons, there are only 20 some state facilities, and there are 203 districts. So what that means is that it's not most rural folks who benefit from this practice. It's only rural folks who happen to have a prison in their district, right? So it's a small segment, among rural areas, and we've had some really interesting conversations with folks, depending on how far they live from the prison, or their family member one district over lives closer to the prison, like that means they have more political influence. All right, so let's get to this understand the overall average impact on people of color in Pennsylvania. So what we did was we calculated the by race, the average Pennsylvania and ethnicity resident, how much their district changed in our scenario. And we found that the average overall, right, the average white Pennsylvania residence district would gain, would lose roughly 59 residents, right, if we counted incarcerated folks where they are their previous home community, right? The average Black person, Black Pennsylvania residence district, in very sharp contrast, would gain about 353 new folks, right? Really showing us on average how underrepresented people of color are in Pennsylvania under our state legislative maps. And so similarly, the average Latinx person's district would gain about 313 new residents. So we see very clearly that white Pennsylvania residents' votes matter more than Black and Latinx residents' votes, right? And that's simply because of our residential segregation, our racial of where people live, right? That on average, a white person is more likely to live in a district that has a prison. And on average, Black and Latinx folks are more likely to live in heavily policed communities, right? So we see political gains being made at the expense of Black and Brown communities. All right, so what's been happening since then? And this, we can, I'm just going to take a few minutes. So to tell you about, very rarely, unfortunately, do we see social science research being used to make policy, right? And so Dr. Kramer and I had no expectation of anything really happening. It's not why we set out to do it. We had been thinking about community level impacts, right? And voting, what's called felon disenfranchisement is very well known, has been gaining a lot of speed and policy change. And so we were like, okay, how else does it affect communities? And we hear less about the political representation part and how the census counts bodies. So we just did it, right? And when we published it in a peer-reviewed journal, not a lot of interest. People were like, this was in 2018, people were like, what is that? Right? Like, I don't know. Like literally we were we were invited for talks. People were like, I don't know whether my audience is going to be interested in that. Could you also talk about felon disenfranchisement? And I'm like, sure, but also this is important. That began to change in recent years as word spread, as local organizations really made prison gerrymandering part of their fight. And it was really exciting and gratifying for us to be able to support those folks with the data that the findings I just showed you. Right, and helping them convey those, and it's it was a really exciting thing. So Joanna McClinton, which her name might sound familiar, she is a state representative local to Philly, and she introduced legislature in she introduced a bill to change how Pennsylvania counts incarcerated folks for their districting to the state legislature and cited our findings. And so that alone was really exciting. Not long after that, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed a lawsuit saying, hey, look at Remster and Kramer's findings. There's racially unequal representation, right? Against the suit. Then the pandemic happened, and it's not past tense, obviously, we all know, but in that time, it was one of just the most incredible things I've ever witnessed. The amount of community organizing during a pandemic is why we no longer have prison gerrymandering in Pennsylvania, right? And so Dr. Kramer and I attended so many virtual events. I mean, we did, it was gaining momentum right before the pandemic broke in March. And so we had done a number of community events, but it was largely about, awareness. People just didn't know, right? And when they start thinking about it, they're like, wait, what? Right? What do you mean? It's a very intuitive, simple idea, but when you don't know, nothing gets done. Right? So we were really happy to be able to support and get social science in there, showing how we can test these things empirically, right? Fast forward to this past summer, as the Legislative Reapportionment Commission, that's Pennsylvania's commission who redraws the maps, right? With 6 hours notice, of course, asked us to come testify and share our findings. And not long after that, there's a lot of questions. It was really, it was probably a career highlight. And I'm going to speed up here, I promise, and get to your questions. But it really, the numbers really spoke to the folks on the commission. combined with people sharing their personal stories of what it feels like to have your body used to benefit correctional staff, right, who in most cases live in the district where they work, who in many cases were, beating folks. Like your abuser is also getting more political power, right? And hearing folks' stories, so we had so many public testimony comments of family and formerly incarcerated folks sharing, what that feels like was so powerful, right? And so as some of you already know, the commission voted to a 3-2 vote to change how we count incarcerated folks in Pennsylvania. Right? And Pennsylvania is actually unique because it was the first commission to decide to just change it, right? So the other 10 or so states that have ended prison gerrymandering did so through another avenue, through the legislature, right? Well, if you know anything about the Pennsylvania state legislature, the bill was, unlikely to get to get through. It did start to raise awareness, though, for sure. And so we're now a model for other states that are thinking that you don't have to, there are other avenues to get this problem fixed. And there was real incentive because, more lawsuits were going to be filed if they didn't, right? And so all of a sudden, 5 years after we started out on this project, Dr. Kramer and I were like in demand constantly. And we now support a range of organizations, like big, small, national, across the country who are interested. They're like, hey, could you do this in our state? I'm like, yeah, right? Has just been so rewarding and fun to see research directly influence policy like that. So we've testified before a handful of other state redistricting commissions, sharing our findings, explaining why Pennsylvania is not a unique case for many reasons, and trying to press upon the importance of using data to make fair and equal policy, right? Yeah, so I mentioned momentum's building, and I think that's, following the wave of the felon disenfranchisement laws, very, we're shifting more to the impact of prison gerrymandering, lesser known, right? So please spread the word, but I said 12 total states, this round of redistricting, right? And why does this matter so much? In part because we have these maps for another 10 years, right? So there's a huge push for commissions to change how they count people right now, right? Some more successful than others. And we've assisted with a lot of folks who are they've never touched criminal justice data, right? So lots of holes in, availability and resources and knowledge that Dr. Kramer and I have been trying to fill. This is why I'm even more frenzied than usual if you're in one of my classes. And so in part because of all of this interest, all of a sudden people were like, oh, wow, this matters. We shifted to look at the new maps in a fairly new project. So now we're looking nationally, right, at as many states as we can get the data for. We have a wonderful research associate who has been putting in so many public records requests and FOIAs to get us data in other states so that we can see with the new maps. So as states pass them into law, right, do those new maps, how bad are things? Right? How racially unequal are people in Idaho? In Idaho, they interestingly split a prison in half to try to make it less of an issue. But I've learned so many things about states that I had no idea, and it's been really, really fun. but we're just at the beginning of that analysis. So we're looking at the 38 states that continue to have prison gerrymandering. So, so that we can support community organizations on the ground that are trying to, end this scourge. And that's our job. We're not organizers or activists, right? We're professors that and social scientists. And so our role is to say, here's how much it matters. Here's some graphics. Do with it what you will. And we're also going to look at the 12 that are supposedly addressing it right now in this round of redistricting and see how successful they are, right? So we have about half a dozen states so far completed. And by and large, and I don't think this is shocking if you think about our country, Texas is just shockingly egregious. And they pass their maps like through in like record pace. They have districts that literally don't even qualify for districts, not size for their district size, like aside from prison gerrymandering. Like it was a real education. And so we've shared that many times since then. And interestingly, on the ground, and we can talk more about whatever anyone is interested in, Texas has so many struggles, right? That they're like, okay, it's on the list, right? So many issues that like prison gerrymandering is on there somewhere, but versus we were very shocked, in other states, how quickly people mobilize when you show people data and say, this is a problem, right? So we're learning on the go. That's really it. I'm happy to go to any aspect that might be on your mind. You can throw it in the chat. You can, of course, always shoot me or Dr. Kramer an email. And you're on the Nova network, so you can get the full article if you want, but there's also a no paywall version. And I should put up, there's a really wonderful Washington Post article. Time did a few. There's been that's what's sort of connected us with folks was the media featuring this issue. Yeah, thanks so much for listening.
Awesome, thanks. Are there any questions? If there aren't, I have one. I'll start as a political science nerd over here. Do you all have any plans to look at resources and allocation of resources to understand the financial impact of, Yeah.
So this is one of the hardest things I have to tell people when they get really excited and are like, people have calculated like, oh my God, if I had this many more people in my community, we could fix my schools, right? Like, because you can figure out how many, like per person federal dollars. Unfortunately, prison gerrymandering only indirectly affects funding. And that's because for most states, our funding formulas are so specific. They're not total population based. So, if it's like, it's something, like single mothers with, children below the poverty line, like the number of those folks in an area dictates, how much money they get. It's never just how many people live in this area or yeah. So they're too specific to directly change how funding is allocated. However, I will note that if you have the equal representation that we all deserve, then you should have better access to your representative, another person in your corner in the state house, right? Advocating for your concerns and potentially getting more funding for your community in that way, right? Yeah, so I've also heard of issues where people are upset about local services, right? Prisons really don't use, they're self-sufficient. They might use the roads, obviously, would be maybe a more reasonable case, in which case, if they're getting money, if there might need to be and it's state by state basis, a discussion around, is there inequality and who's paying for what? Okay, we need to fix this. It's not an excuse to keep prison gerrymandering and keep people under or unequally represented. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Dr. Birch. Right, Dr. Kramer's noted some idiosyncrasies. What else is on your mind?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, what did you mean by like 4 districts would be legally too small? Because if it's like too small, wouldn't it just be combined with like another one?
So drawing maps is gets complicated quickly, but and this was, yeah, you just asked us in the chat. Thank you. So what they do is most states take their total population, right? So like how many people are living in Texas in the 2020 census, and they divide it by the number of districts they have. And then each district has to be within a threshold of plus or minus 5% population, right? So there's obviously a little bit of wiggle room there. And that's what I mentioned. That's what I meant when I mentioned like it depends whether removing a prison or adding people is enough. It depends how close you are to the cut points to begin with. But then so in order to be legally compliant, you have to be within that range. If not, there's grounds for suing, right? And it's sort of Texas is sort of a very brazen case where they don't seem to care, right? I mean, so in Pennsylvania, we have quite a track record of the last set of maps was actually thrown out by the state Supreme Court after a long, and they had to redraw them because, not because of prison gerrymandering, because they were unequal, right? And so that is something that most redistricting commissions are like, this is like years worth of work, or months of intensive work at minimum. They don't want to have to go back and redo their work, right? So they're constantly trying to prevent a lawsuit from happening, which is why like public hearings and community conversations, like, did we get this right, are really important. In terms of like adjusting, so we have a set number of districts per state. I mean, they can change them if they wish, but they're written into our codes and constitution and whatnot. But you're right that we can just move the lines a little bit, right? And so prison gerrymandering, I'm really glad you brought this up, is not going to like radically change the political landscape, because in order to make them legally, we're talking about moving boundaries, sometimes a couple miles, one direction or another. These are not huge, dramatic changes, right? It's just about ensuring that everybody gets what we were supposed to get, right? Equal representation. Does that make sense? And Dr. Kramer can feel free to chime in.
That does, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Brianna. 3 days ago, there was an article in the Inquirer about the city of Philadelphia and the city council redrawing the maps. Do you know anything?
Yep.
I thought there was very little in the article.
Yeah. And we are here at a Villanova event, and that's wonderful, but we often get referenced as the Villanova study. And so it comes up under my Google, or not under my name. Anyway, so the Committee of 70 who's raising that concern consulted with us maybe 6 months ago, 5 months ago, wanting to know what would Philadelphia need to do? What kind of data do we need to address the jails, right? Because so when Pennsylvania changed their policy, and this is not uncommon, unfortunately, they only changed for the state folks, right? And they even whittled away a little bit more since then, but for time purposes. So most folks are, it's about 60-40 sometimes, it depends. But our local jails are not part of that policy change, right? And most local jails are so small, it's not enough to have an impact. But in a place like Philadelphia, where you have close to 5,000 folks up in the Northeast jail facilities, that's a lot of people, right? And yet, all right, so when Pennsylvania changes how they draw their state districts, there's no requirement for local governments to use that same data set, which is what the Inquirer article was like, hey, use the adjusted data that the commission did, where at least state folks are counted properly, right? Because that means, I think they said 6,000 more people coming back to Philly, right? But then we've got the additional layer of what about those 4,000 some people who are counted, so Philadelphia, many city council districts, right? They're that is Northeast Philly, the district, that city council district is really far from the districts that most of the folks who are waiting trial, most of them who are held in so jail versus prison. And just to speed up, city council districts are really big in Philadelphia. They're, I think, 150,000 some people. And so if we were to it's called reallocate. If we were to count incarcerated folks who were in Philly's jail at their previous address, it's not going to have much of an impact on the communities that are missing those folks. What it would change is the district that contains the jail, right? The city council person who's representing, so we're again talking locally, who has that prison in their district is benefiting a lot from a whole bunch of people that they don't consider constituents, who aren't meaningful parts of their community, and less so at the expense of other districts, because when we diffuse people across districts, 4,000 some people is not enough to make a huge difference on the missing part. Does that make sense? So like, it's important to fix it and do it right, no matter what. There's no incentive. Whether it remains unknown whether Philly will even use the state adjusted one, and whether they would, pursue reallocating folks. I don't know. I don't have any secret intel on that part. See, got some chats. So our fantastic librarian Deborah's question about so maybe please, I might be misunderstanding, so correct me, but as I talk through this, but folks who, so it's a very people get amped up really quickly when they realize that we're, that we have, it's a slippery slope. Like, if there's unequal representation here, where else? Like, what, do we not have a democracy? And where we've seen them, and that's why Pennsylvania wouldn't have changed, nor would anywhere else across the country have changed if it hadn't been for folks advocating, organizing, coming together, saying, hey, this is a problem, right? And I certainly wish that we didn't have to have data to convince folks, but we were happy to provide that support, right? But it was very powerful to folks who live in those communities and are like, wait, I've been working on voting campaigns for years and getting out the vote, and you're saying that we're not even equally represented when we get the vote out, right? Like it happens long before people ever enter a voting booth or fill out their absentee registration. And it was, let's see, Eastern State Penitentiary is where we first started sharing our findings about prison gerrymandering. They have a local community speaker series. It's really wonderful. I highly recommend it if you're interested. I think they were doing virtual for the pandemic. Anyway, but folks started coming up to us after that saying, thank you for doing this. This is something we've been talking about I remember talking about it in the yard in the 90s, right? At formerly, returning citizens, formerly incarcerated folks, saying we knew that this was happening. And so Dr. Kramer and I are actually working on a piece right now about how behind social science, frankly, was in understanding, uncovering and documenting and bringing the data to the table. It's a really embarrassing, what happens when we don't stay in dialogue with the folks that are studying. Right, and I'd say that like as a discipline as a whole, that we have that the best work comes or the most progress or understanding when affected persons, social scientists, and policymakers and community organizations all come together. Right, is what we can see happening. But unfortunately, the folks who are most impacted have known. Right. And it's part of how the system, at least in our experience, folks that we've talked to, but it's part of how the system stays in place, right? When you have less of a voice, no matter how loud you shout, you're underrepresented, you're less likely to be heard, right?
Thanks. I guess I was also interested in whether you've seen any acknowledgement from the state representatives whose constituent, like now the state is recognizing that they have constituents who are not currently physically located in their district, but are being counted as their constituents. Is there any kind of
folks,
recognition?
yes. Yeah, they talk about it a lot. Like, and it was funny when we were talking with folks at the state capitol, staff for those folks were like, I never knew this was a thing until I got this job, and the letters that are coming in and the calls like that, we had to devote a whole staff person to these folks have real serious issues, and there are people too, right? They really did view them as like they didn't balk at it for a moment, and so it's a huge weight off to have at least the state incarcerated folks counted equally to going forward, try to equalize the workload, for sure, yeah. I've also seen some workload fights among rural legislators who realize that their colleague in the next district over who has a prison, they have less work to do. Right. So like in Arizona right now, that's like obviously a very Republican held state, and their fight is it's infighting, right? Politically speaking, where you have, some representatives feel like, wait, my buddy so-and-so has how much no, that's not fair. I want to end this, right? So really different conversations happening depending on what the local politics and interests are. I mean, we have Montana also changed after Pennsylvania did for really different reasons, right? Like we were talking to them and like, they have indigenous folks there, but like talking to those folks about racial inequality, like was not that was not what they were interested in. They were interested in like the libertarian, like no one should be benefiting from this. Everybody should be counted, right? And so they came at it from a different angle, but you know, there's also very few incarcerated people in Montana, by the way. But still, like I would say broad, and it doesn't actually divide politically well at all. I just think it's interesting context in terms of who it benefits because of how suburbanized we became, right? So that was part of our findings that I didn't mention because it's a non-finding, where the 8 districts total that were too big or too small did not, they split equally among districts that were represented by Democrats and Republicans. So it's really just a good governance practice. Yeah. One last thing is just to reiterate the impact on entire communities of color, right, is huge. And I think that's where the action, a lot of the motivation is coming from, is with racial segregation and the way race and class are intertwined in the US, people don't choose where they live, right? They live where they can afford to live. Especially once we get down to lower income brackets, and every person in that district is underrepresented, right? Grandma down the street who, you know, has never been incarcerated, it was never intended as a punishment, right? Like versus felon disenfranchisement, taking away your vote while you're incarcerated, in some states formerly for life, that was part of the punishment. Unique globally, right? No other westernized nation takes away the right to vote. But this is a community impact. It's not just that individual's represented in the wrong place, right? And that's huge. I mean, my criminology students know that people victimize the folks who live near them, right? They don't travel, they're less likely to like travel to a different district to commit a crime. And so we're actually disadvantaging the very victims of those folks' crimes, right? By counting them in the wrong place. That's the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing, right? Yeah. It's 12:30 though, so.
There are no other thoughts or questions. Thank you all so much for coming, and you can always contact Professors Kramer and Remster via email if you have any questions or additional thoughts. And feel free to enjoy the rest of the day of Freedom Schools. Hope to see you around at the 1 o'clock and 2:30 sessions. Have a great day.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Spread the word. Appreciate it.